Do you need the government's permission to work? Increasingly, the answer to that question is yes. Over time, state governments across the country, including here in Maine, have chosen to subject more and more professions to occupational licenses. These licenses impose massive time and monetary barriers that keep qualified people from working. The Maine Heritage Policy Center has recently issued a report titled Let Us Work, which evaluates the occupational licensing environment in Maine and notes that many of the professions licensed here make no logical sense and are completely unnecessary. State Senator Eric Brakey is a leader on this issue in the Maine legislature and recently sat down with us to talk about occupational licensing and relayed the story of one egregious example of licensing gone wrong.
The case of hair braiding licensing requirements was not just an issue in Maine, but it was an issue in several other states. And there was a very high-profile case out in Utah that the Institute for Justice highlighted of a woman she was actually from Africa. She was an immigrant, came to America, and she was in Africa. She had developed a skill of hair braiding. And she came over and established in Utah and wanted to offer those services, and she did it for 4 years until some competitor came to her and said, if you keep this up, we're going to report you to the licensing board because you don't have a license to do this. And the license that she would have been required to get was an overall license for, I believe, overall cosmetology, and she would have had to do years of education, spend a great deal of time and money in order to get this license, and the education she would have been required to get had nothing to do with hair braiding. They didn't even teach it. So that's one of the problems with a lot of these occupational licensure requirements is the standards, the hoops that you are forced to jump through. Sometimes they're just completely arbitrary. They're designed by the licensing boards for the people already in the profession, and they can be designed to keep people out.
Senator Brakey's story is not unique to Utah, nor is it unique to hair braiding. Recently we spoke with Charles Schaefer, a 2003 law school graduate from Connecticut, now residing in Quebec. For years during his professional career, Mr. Schaefer advocated for and represented clients with disabilities for state government in legal matters. However, he did not pursue law in Maine because he could not afford the time and money necessary to meet the requirements.
And so for me to go back and get the certification would cost $50,000 or $60,000 if I could even get into a program, because they won't count any of my previous education.
Johnny Morgan had a similar experience. Morgan worked as a nurse for 28 years in the Army Civilian Service, serving in multiple states and several countries abroad. Upon moving to Maine several years ago, she was forced to wait for over 3 months while the state nursing board verified her license. Meanwhile, she had several job offers from hospitals in desperate need of her services, but she couldn't work despite her obvious qualifications.
Well, prior to moving to Maine, I'll tell you, I had retired from federal service, and I did a couple of travel jobs. And since I was then licensed in Texas, Texas is a compact state. Maine is a compact state. There's about 25 of them, I think. I'm not certain. And you can work in compact states under your state license until you become a resident. If I decide to move to another state, then I have to be a resident in that state. I have to get that state license. I got my original license in Oklahoma, so I had to have an original verification of my state license, the first I'd ever gotten, which was Oklahoma. Well, they have a form you fill out that has to be stamped with the Board of Nursing from that state, filled out, sent back to them. You call your state Board of Nursing, you don't get who you want to talk to. You go through the whole phone service and all, and you finally find someone and all. Well, it was never achieved online or over the phone. I ended up going to Oklahoma, and I visited the Department of Nursing in person, paid whatever it was, $10, $15, got a copy of my 1984 licensure, and had it stamped or certified or whatever, and then had them send it directly to the state of Maine. Well, another few weeks. Well, unfortunately, we got the background check, but you are not the same person. Your address doesn't match up, and your social security number's off. So I'm like, well, I know what my address was in Austin. I know my social security number, blah, blah. I said, read to me who you have. Well, it was a male with a different middle name in a different town in Texas. And I said, well, that's not me. Well, unfortunately, you get that word a lot from the board. Unfortunately, So you fill out another application thinking they're going to fix it. Well, you got to put your credit card in again, pay again. So the second time I paid $30, waited, and it went through within a few weeks like it should have.
By maintaining these needless, duplicative barriers to entry, Maine is losing hundreds of people that could be filling jobs that are in desperate need of qualified professionals. Both Schaefer and Morgan had already proven their competency, but were asked to jump through additional hoops simply to please the state of Maine.
If you go through law school or medical school, nursing school, that should, and you pass, that should be your measure of competence. I mean, you've already gone through a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-year program in medical school, and you've made it through, and now your 6 years, and I had this happen to a friend of mine who finally gave up, but who was a physician, he was a nurse and a paramedic, and wanted to go to medical school, did go to medical school, graduated, and there's a series of tests to take for medical school. He couldn't finish the last one, and you're only allowed so many tries, and then they told him he had to repeat medical school. So he said, no. But if you go through 6 years of school and you pass and you have a good grade and stuff, that should be your level of competence, because over time people got to know you, they saw your work, maybe you did one thing better than another, but that's what people do in practice too. And yet they were able to say that you were competent to practice, and it comes down to one test. To me, that's just nuts. And you can see why people don't want to go into professions. And in fact, in the legal world, I noticed a story the other day that law school admissions are way, way down. It's because it's a roll of the dice. If you want to, and the bar failure rate is really shooting up.
I don't know why a license verification from one state to the next shouldn't suffice. We take the same Board of Nursing exam, the exact same exam in every state. I mean, any kind of delinquencies or pending actions, it's right there. It's not that difficult to find it. They do fingerprints randomly every couple of years in Texas, and then, like I said, working for the federal government, I had them done all the time. Anytime you work with small children or anything, you need to have complete background checks periodically. But this is just kind of above and beyond if you've already, gone through those hurdles, to just have to keep bashing your head against the state of Maine for the same thing.
Government claims that these requirements are necessary to protect consumers. The public also tends to believe this because of the misconception that licensure guarantees quality of service and public safety. But these claims do not hold up to scrutiny when you examine professions like interior designers, auctioneers, taxidermists, hair braiders, or, as Senator Brakey notes, even something as innocent as sign language interpreters.
We're one of the few states that actually licenses sign language interpreters. Most states don't, but we do here in Maine. And it's really hard for me to understand the argument why. I mean, if someone is a bad sign language interpreter and you are, a deaf person, I think you find out pretty quickly that this person doesn't know sign language.
Right.
At least when you had the guy at Nelson Mandela's funeral, like if you remember the
Yes,
sign language interpreter there. I mean, we all found out pretty quickly, like, this guy doesn't know how to sign language, doesn't know sign language. It's the same as, like, if someone was interpreting French or German or anything. If they don't know the language, you're going to find out pretty quickly.
Even for professions that ultimately do relate to health and safety, the idea that licensing ensures quality and safety is misplaced.
Service is not better. We're fooling the public. The public feels that they should be safe because you have a license. But nobody looks at what's behind the license. You can be a bad doctor and still have a license. Are you going to have any patients? No. In a small town like this, you would have no patients. To me, a lot of licensing has nothing to do with testing competence. It has nothing to do with your ability to perform an occupation, and that, especially in Maine, but probably more places now, it prevents people from doing things. It prevents really competent people from being able to serve the public that are perfectly capable of doing it and have the knowledge and experience to do it.
Asked if she thought the current licensing system ensured better quality in her industry, Morgan was very clear.
No, absolutely not. All it does is see who will persevere. who wants a job or needs a job bad enough that they'd put up with all of the hurdles you have to go through to get a license here? Because I'm telling you, if I hadn't moved here, there's no way. Wouldn't have cared.
Maine loses so much by having a burdensome licensing regime. Occupational licensing inflates the cost of goods and services, locks people out of meaningful work opportunities, and it stops talented professionals from pursuing fulfilling careers here in Maine.
So it's just a crazy thing where we're losing a lot of, in a state like Maine, I mean, I can tell you from working at DHHS that there's a huge shortage of qualified people. And there are people that are perfectly capable of doing it and would be, fine at doing it, but they can't.
I would have left. You couldn't put up with it that long to just be in limbo waiting for a nursing license. You can't do it. Anybody that depends on their income can't just sit and wait, and all you get on the phone is, unfortunately, there's nothing we can do on this end.
The good news is we can do things to fix this broken system. Senator Brakey has sponsored LD 1036, which is a resolve that is intended to study the repeal of occupational licensing requirements for certain occupations. This would have been an excellent start, but as Senator Brakey notes, the bill ran into overwhelming opposition.
The bill didn't even eliminate the licenses.
You're right.
It just said, let's study the issue. Let's have a comprehensive look at whether or not these licenses make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that, even just raising the question, provoked a huge degree of backlash.
Despite that opposition, the Maine Heritage Policy Center has been advocating for LD 1036, as well as the Right to Earn a Living Act, which would give tremendous freedom to Maine workers. Detailed on that legislation can be found in our Let Us Work report. But for some, like Schaefer, the desire is even more basic.
I think we should go back to a training system, and I understand why we don't. It's a cost savings measure, but my issue is, how much do you save? I mean, ask those, ask people that die, or ask people that don't get a service, or ask people in Scottsbluff County that have to wait months for an attorney. Would they have rather saved, have the state save a nickel, or I'll take a chance with you? Because if you're incompetent, you're not going to be in practice. I mean, word gets out, and the free market is pretty effective that way.
To learn more about occupational licensing reform, visit mainepolicy.org.